Great. Thank you guys so much for inviting me to do this talk. I'm really excited to be here and to share with you guys a little bit about the research that I'm very passionate about. So the talk, it's going to be a pretty standard talk procedure. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of my research in general, and then we'll take a really deep dive into the work that I have looking at work and family issues and how those affect our physiological health and physiological activity. And then we'll finish up with some ideas that I have for kind of where I want to take this line of research. So first, a little bit about who am I as a researcher. I consider myself a work and family researcher, so that means that I study how people manage their work and family responsibilities. And I think a lot of people care about this. We know in the scholarly literature there's been a lot of interest, particularly in recent years, on this topic. We also know that kind of people everywhere care about how to balance work and family. This is a common topic of conversation, and people are often interested when I say that's kind of what I study. We also see work-family issues highlighted in the news, particularly in high-profile business people. And we know that workers are increasingly asking for better work-life balance from their organizations. So organizations are starting to really care about this issue. And then we see even on a national level, right, countries are being rated on how well they address work-family balance issues as an indicator of country success and well-being. So on a lot of different levels, we care about work and family. And of course, this is for really good reason. We know that work-family issues are important for our psychological health and well-being. They affect things like how much we sleep and the kinds of foods that we eat. We also have some emerging evidence, including some of what I'll be presenting today, that work-family matters for our physiological health and well-being. And then work and family are both social domains, right? So how we manage work and family affects our relationships with our supervisors and with our children. So with that in mind, my research really tries to help people lead healthy work and family lives, right? So I have a couple of different domains that I study to meet this end. The first is really research that kind of links work and family issues with health, right? And so by health, I really do mean kind of broad health, so psychological health, physiological health, health behaviors, and I also study both acute and more chronic or long-term health outcomes. In addition to just making those basic connections and why they occur, I also look at how people can take control of their own work-family management. So what are strategies that we can use as an individual to more successfully navigate work and family? So to that end, I look at negotiation between couples, meaningfulness in work and family, and time allocation between work and family domains. And then another thread that kind of underlies a lot of my research is giving a voice to underrepresented populations. So for example, I've done work on student workers, shift workers, single mothers, looking at child outcomes, and then looking at non-US contexts. So to really try and kind of highlight population-specific issues. So most of what I'm going to be presenting today falls within this kind of first bubble here, looking at work, family, and health. And in particular, we'll be diving into the work that I have that looks at physiological activity and physiological health. Now, in order to answer this question of how does work affect our health, I rely on the allostatic load model to guide my thinking. So we'll kind of dig into that first so you can kind of get an idea of where I'm coming from. The allostatic load model is a more modern theory of stress. It basically suggests a pathway by which our everyday psychological experiences eventually manifest in long-term disease and illness. So one of the cornerstones of the allostatic load model is this idea of allostasis, which essentially suggests that our body reacts to the environment, right? When we experience something, we have a reaction. And over time, those reactions can accumulate and develop into allostatic load, or wear and tear on the body and brain that results from that allostasis process. Now, there's a multi-step kind of model that explains this. So what happens is we first have some kind of stressor event, and I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, and so naturally, this is usually something about work. Right? So we might have workload, we might have time pressure. Let's just say you get in an argument with your boss, right? So we then react to that event. So that might look like you getting angry or frustrated. That might look like elevated blood pressure or heart rate, or it might look like you reaching for a glass of wine at the end of the day when you go home, right? Now, let's say you keep getting in those arguments with your boss, right? So it starts occurring over and over again. What we start to see is a lack of adaptation or recovery. So you might still be thinking about that argument even when you're at home several hours later. Or you might have prolonged heart rate recovery, such that it takes you several minutes, hours to kind of physiologically calm down from that interaction. Or maybe you are consistently reaching for that glass of wine or two at the end of the day. Now, again, with repeated exposure, we start to see kind of longer term, more kind of chronic outcomes. So you see elevated immune biomarkers, hypertension, elevated cholesterol, right? So changes in your resting state. And then, of course, this predisposes us to longer term disease and illness, things like psychological disorders, mortality, cardiovascular disease, that kind of thing. So this is the process that I use to kind of frame my questions in this area. And specifically, a lot of my questions revolve around how and when work and interval stressors are associated with physiological health. So the studies that I'm going to present for you today, the first looks at more long-term health outcomes, so linking chronic work stressors to behavioral and metabolic health. We're then going to take it in and start to look at more acute reactions. So specifically looking at couple negotiations and how those elicit physiological and psychological responses. And then we'll kind of take it to the field and look at how those work-family conflicts change our physical and psychological activity throughout the day. So the first study that I have for you is on challenge and hindrance stressors. This is an archival data study where we use the MIDAS to look at longer term implications of work stress. This is something that hopefully is nearing publication. We have under third round of review at Journal of Occupational Health Psychology. So the purpose of this was to really understand how chronic and challenge hindrance stressors are related to behavioral and metabolic health. In the industrial, organizational, and occupational health literature, we've, over the years, discovered many different kinds of workplace stressors, right? There's a lot of stuff that stresses us out. So everything from an abusive boss to high workload to time pressure to maybe bureaucratic red tape that may or not be provided by the IRB. And so these things, they are generally considered toxic for our health and well-being, right? They're bad, they make us frustrated, and they're associated with psychological strain. But actually, in the early 2000s, Kavanaugh and colleagues came out with a theory that says maybe all of these work stressors are not necessarily the same thing. And we might actually be able to categorize stressors into two groups. There are challenges, which are stressors that are stressful, but at the same time, they have a silver lining because they help us to achieve our goals and they might motivate us. So these are things like time pressure or workload. On the other hand, we might have hindrance stressors. So these are things, again, stressful to experience, but they don't have a silver lining. And in fact, they just make it harder to accomplish our goals. And so these are very kind of frustrating stressors. Things like maybe having an abusive supervisor or experiencing that bureaucratic red tape. Now, when we look at outcomes, typical outcomes associated with stressors, things like job satisfaction, burnout, performance, what we find is that those hindrance stressors are associated just like we'd expect. So if you experience hindrances, you're less satisfied, you perform worse, and you're more burnt out than if you didn't have those stressors, right? But when we look at challenges, we see a very different pattern, such that they're positively associated with job satisfaction and performance. And while they tend to also be positively associated with burnout, those relationships are much weaker than what we would see with hindrance stressors. So we looked at this and we noticed, well, but a lot of these studies are based on self-report, psychological kinds of constructs, especially when we're thinking about health. And we know that health is multifaceted, right? It includes physiological and behavioral health as well. So what we wanted to know is, do these challenge hindrance distinctions generalize to other kinds of health outcomes? In addition, we saw that most of this research was cross-sectional. The self-report survey, certainly there are methodological issues there that could be kind of influencing our conclusions, and so we wanted to see, do these kinds of relationships also hold over time? So based on our allostatic load model, because we have chronic stressors in this study, we were looking at more chronic secondary mediators here. Specifically, we focused on metabolic risk. This was for a couple of reasons. One, there's not a whole lot on physiology and workplace stressors from the IO literature, but we do have suggests that the metabolic system is perhaps most consistently affected by workplace factors, as opposed to things like the cardiovascular system or immune markers. In addition, we know that metabolic risk is really important, right? It's linked to a lot of endpoints that we care about in our society, things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And so we wanted to address an outcome that had important practical meaning. So we paired that with the challenge and hindrance stressor framework. We predicted that both challenges and hindrances would be positively associated with metabolic risk, but that those relationships would be weaker when we're looking at challenges as compared to hindrance stressors. In addition, we wanted to incorporate those primary mediators. Now, because we're looking at more chronic exposure, we're operationalizing these as kind of health habits, right? So do you regularly smoke, your frequency of alcohol consumption, and then your frequency of high-fat, high-sugar food consumption. And again, consistent with that challenge hindrance model, we suggested that both of these are going to be associated with these kind of behavioral coping mechanisms, but that those relationships would be stronger for hindrances compared to challenges. And that then, of course, would be linked back to metabolic risk, completing an indirect association. So we dug into the MIDAS data set. We used data from the second wave of MIDAS. Our sample was generally half male, half female, about middle age, mostly white, well educated in a variety of jobs. The MIDAS procedure starts off with a general survey phase, so everyone gets a telephone survey and then a written survey. This is where we got our measures of challenge and hindrance stressors and demographics. And then people had the option to opt into sub-studies, including the biomarker study. So everyone in our study participated also in the biomarker study between 4 and 62 months after that initial general survey. The biomarker study was a 2-day, 1-night clinic visit. So here participants had a physical, they had health checklist, they indicated their smoking, alcohol consumption, and high-risk eating habits. And then they had indicators of metabolic risk measured. So these were things like glucose, cholesterol, BMI, that kind of thing. So we tested our hypotheses using a path analysis. As you can see, testing both direct and indirect associations between our stressors and metabolic risk factors. I have the graph with all of the numbers. The numbers are small. You probably don't want to see them, but if you do, I can show them to you later. What's important is what we found, right? So we did indeed find that hindrances are relatively more detrimental than challenges. So specifically, hindrances were more strongly associated with unhealthy eating compared to challenges, and hindrances were associated with smoking, whereas challenges were not, right? So this suggests that yes, that those challenge hindrance dimensions do kind of generalize beyond just psychological health and well-being, and they generalize over time. We also saw that those health behaviors are really important for linking challenges and hindrances with metabolic risk. So just the correlations were not significant generally between work stressors and metabolic risk, but the indirect associations were. So hindrances were associated with metabolic risk through unhealthy eating, and challenges were actually associated with metabolic risk through alcohol consumption. One of the things that we found, we analyzed this model 10,000 different ways. All of these 10,000 different ways, high-risk eating emerged as a really consistent, robust mediator, which suggests that high-risk eating might be a key intervention factor, right? So when you think of foods that organizations might offer, might want to just stick with healthy foods. Similarly, employees can take responsibility themselves and just kind of pack themselves healthy food for lunch. Alternatively, we can target at the source in terms of hindrance factors, so reducing interruptions in the workplace, or things like training your supervisors to make sure they're nice to their employees so we don't trigger this process. And then finally, so one of the indirect associations that I mentioned that was actually counter to our hypothesis was that challenges were more strongly associated with alcohol consumption, right, which was then associated with less metabolic risk, actually. So I'll just walk this through. So you have a challenging day at work, right? Then you're more likely to drink a glass of wine, and then you have better metabolic health. So I like this finding. I think this is pretty cool. So it suggests that, yeah.
Is that just categorical, or is it dichotomous of alcohol consumption versus not, or is it more alcohol consumption leads to better?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It is more frequent alcohol consumption. So it was number of days per week, right? It was like the number of servings per week, essentially. So how often are you consuming alcohol per week? So it is not just yes, no. So it is a continuous scale.
So you're recommending that people drink heavily after?
Heavily. So actually, one caveat. Thank you, Bill. One caveat. So we tended to have the range of alcohol consumption in our sample was actually pretty small. So it was mostly down on that lower end of the scale. So I don't know that we can generalize to say at that upper end of the scale we would see the same things. So we know alcohol is curvilinearly associated with metabolic risk. So maybe not quite that far. Yeah.
Are the kind of challenges related to socioeconomic status, or is that controlled for in them?
That's a good question. We did run analyses controlling for socioeconomic factors, and everything still came out. Yeah.
One of the things I'm interested in is the idea that these two types of challenges, though, they often co-occur, and I feel like intuitively anyway, they should interact with each other, right? So the time pressure thing, or deadline, if you will, might be a motivator and a good thing in some sense, but when I'm fighting against bureaucratic red tape, then it might exacerbate the effect of the bureaucratic red tape, or so.
Yeah.
It's not a component of your model there that I saw.
No, yeah. So we did not look at interactive effects. The correlation between the two is like 0.11. And that's pretty consistent. There's like small positive correlation generally in other studies too. So that's certainly possible, although having one doesn't necessarily mean you have the other. Yeah.
I think I noticed that people took the post-survey, the metabolic measures between 4 and 62 months.
Yeah.
So was there a trend on the later side or middle or standard deviation on that?
Yeah, so most people were within a year, and we did do a lot of analysis around, does that time lag matter? How does it matter? Like if we control for that, if we use it as a moderator, and basically we found that it like whenever we put it in the model, it was non-significant. But yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
With the alcohol consumption, is there any chance that is kind of related to or masked by the idea of like social support? The idea that people tend to drink more, I think, like socially than necessarily just everyone was home by themselves. So is it somehow that people that were more social are drinking more, and then that's showing that more?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. We didn't look at that possibility. It certainly could be that way. The measure doesn't capture like whether or not this was a social thing, and I didn't try controlling for social support, but maybe. Be interesting. Yeah.
Can you give us a little specific information about how hindrances and challenges are actually measured in the survey?
Yeah. All right. Here's where I've got to escape, and we're going to look at my many, many slides. So yes, we've got the measures are right here. So you can see here we've got 3 items for challenges. So working intensively, does your work demand a high level of skill or expertise? How often do you have to initiate things? Whereas hindrances were more, a lot of these were interpersonal issues, right? So using sexual slurs or jokes, being ignored, being interrupted. So they're very, and we did a lot, we have multiple pilot studies on kind of validating these measures, and we did find that they're aligned with other measures of challenges and hindrances, and so we're pretty confident that these are solid. Yeah?
Just unpacking this notion of challenge versus hindrance. The way these these questions are asked, doesn't say how successful you are. So there may be challenges, but the question, how you meet those challenges can either be incredibly stressful because you can't meet them,
Right.
or perhaps in another way beneficial because you can. And even if you can, they may also introduce other stressors because you had to work so hard to do it. So I'm not quite sure how you make these distinctions.
Yeah, so the challenge stressor framework, their challenge hindrance framework basically says those kinds of appraisals don't matter. There are kind of objectively challenging things and objectively hindering things, but there's been some research challenging that and looking at, for example, appraisals of those stressors. And the results on that are kind of mixed. Some hindrances tend to be pretty consistently like hindrances. Some challenges are a little bit more wishy-washy for the reasons that you're mentioning. Yeah, and we didn't assess perceptions here. In our validation work, we did, and we found these were generally perceived as challenges versus stressor or hindrances, but it could definitely be a factor. Yeah.
So the MIDAS study actually has a lot of items in it getting at concepts of personal control. Because that was one of the motivations for the study in the first place. It looks to me like your challenge hindrance items vary with respect to the degree of internal control that individuals have over the situation.
Yeah.
So you have powerful others and most of the hindrances that are actively piling on, adding to your woes, harassing you, whatever. On the challenge side, you have a lot of apparent control over how you are allocating your work to get up to speed to meet the challenge.
Yeah.
So are these effects significant controlling on the MIDAS measures of locus of control that are available?
That's a good question. So I did not control for locus of control. I can tell you in developing this study, we had other items in here which we thought were representative of challenges, but they were much more confounded with control, exactly like you're mentioning. And I think part of it is that that's part of what makes these challenges instead of hindrances, right? That you can do something so they're motivating for performance. So I can tell you that with those more control items in there, we found essentially the same pattern of results as we're finding here. So I don't know how much of a difference it would necessarily make. And maybe, even controlling for that might just explain why challenges are better. Like, I don't know that it would necessarily undermine our conclusions here, but rather kind of elaborate on why they might be coming out. Yeah.
So I know MIDAS has data on personality, and the scales aren't always high in reliability, and reviewers keep pointing that out to try to publish with MIDAS data.
Yeah.
But is it possible that conscientiousness moderates some of this, so people who are lower in conscientiousness are just more relaxed about not coping with hindrances, and also do extroversion and neuroticism just positively and negatively bias things?
So it's possible, but I would think that because these really, so it's possible. We actually have another study that I'm not discussing that looks at sleep and the same challenge hindrance with the MIDAS data set, and I can tell you in those analyses we did control for personality and it didn't make a difference. Now that's not our same outcomes that we have here. And so it could possibly make a difference, but honestly, I think we would probably find about the same thing. It doesn't really matter. All right, I'm gonna move on. Yeah. But that's exciting that you guys are interested. Cool, thanks. Hopefully you'll be ready for your public consumption soon. All right. Okay, so for this next study, we kind of wanted to hone in a little bit more and look at more kind of acute reactions, right? So this is a couple on decision making. This is a lab-based study that we're currently still running. The money's about to run out, so we will be done very soon. But for now, what I have for you are some preliminary analyses that I just presented last month at the Academy of Management. So in moving to this study, we're moving from focusing on kind of work and health to more of a focus on work, family, and health. And in the work-family literature, we often study a concept called work-family conflict. This basically happens when you have work stuff and you have family stuff and you can't always get everything done, right? They sometimes conflict with one another. And so your work might make it difficult to do everything that you want to for your family, or vice versa. So we have a lot of research on work-family conflict. This concept was developed in the 80s. It's one of the most popular concepts that we have. We know work-family conflict is associated with lots of stuff we care about: work and family success, health behaviors, psychological well-being, and then to some extent physical and physiological health. Now, much of this research is done from a levels-based perspective, and by that I mean we give people a scale and we say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much work-family conflict do you have, right? So really what we're getting at here are general perceptions of work-family conflict. So what I'm going to argue, and what these studies are going to demonstrate, is that this is great, right? It's great for establishing kind of basic relationships, looking at between persons associations, but we don't actually know what these measures are tapping into, right? Because as work-family conflict occurs on a daily basis, it's actually an episode, right? We have an event. So you're at work and you receive a phone call from the school, and now you have to deal with something, maybe your child is sick, and so you have to deal with that. It is an event that has a start and an end, and you have to work to resolve that event. So what I'm going to argue, and what these studies are going to demonstrate, is that really an episodic focus kind of yields a lot more insight into the experience of that work-family conflict, and what is that like. So that's what we're going to focus on, is episodes. Again, digging into single experiences, and this is great because we can get more at issues of causality, we can understand the worker experience, and we can understand how those episodes are nested within time and related to other time varying experiences. So when we experience a work-family conflict episode, I would argue there's usually a decision to be made. Right? So if you get that phone call from your child's school, you have to decide, am I going to leave work and go take care of my child, or am I going to try and work out some other situation so that I can keep working and somebody else takes care of what's going on there. In addition, a lot of these decisions are not made in isolation, but with our partners, right? And so it's important to consider, when we're talking about work-family as it is experienced, it's important to consider the individual's decision-making, but also how they make those decisions with their partners. So the purpose of this study was really to dig into that experience and understand what happens when couples negotiate work-family decisions. For the purpose of honing in on a specific population, we are just looking at heterosexual couples without children here. So decision-making, work-family decision-making specifically, is a process where you're making a decision about work or family that affects the alternative domain. So this looks much like that child example where you're working, you receive a call from the school, and you have to decide what are you going to do, right? This is thought to underlie many work-family conflict events, so we can often think of work-family conflict as a decision. And we know there's not a whole lot of research on work-family conflict decision-making, but we do know that there are a couple of different kinds of decisions that we might make. So that child example is an example of a daily decision. So these are things that are more transient. They kind of come and go. We resolve them relatively quickly. In contrast, you might have anchoring decisions. So these are very big work-family decisions that kind of set the stage for all of those little decisions. So for example, where your spouse might apply to jobs and what kind of jobs you're going to take, right? Those set the stage for your context managing work and family. So when we started thinking about, okay, what are we going to expect during these decision-making episodes, we of course turned to the literature and to theory. And theory suggests that work-family conflict is stressful, right? And this is for a couple different reasons. It's not a pleasant thing, right? By definition, it's a hindrance, so you're thwarting performance either in the work and or in the family domain. They're considered to be effortful to navigate, so you have to think. They might involve, emotional labor. They might involve you drawing upon social resources. And they might be unexpected and social in nature, which we know is important for eliciting physiological stress responses. In addition, we've got a lot of, again, between persons, levels-based research that says work-family conflict perceptions are associated with things like anxiety, depression, stress. So we suggested that, okay, based on this, when couples are negotiating decisions, we should see that's a little bit stressful, right? So maybe we see elevated heart rate, we see steadier heartbeats, so lower heart rate variability, and we see elevated anxiety and threat. In addition, we wanted to look again at this as a couple. This is one of the very few studies to consider decision making within the couple context. And so an interesting question is, do members of the couple experience that decision similarly, right? Or are there perhaps differences such that men and women are reacting to these discussions differently? And we know that there are differences in both work and family by sex, right? So women tend to do more at home, and men tend to be more objectively successful in their careers. So maybe it's something about this negotiation process that's experienced differently between men and women. So we decided to compare, and we thought, well, maybe because women feel more pressure to adhere to gender norms, it's going to be a stressful experience for them, or at least more stressful than their male peers. So we expect that women will have higher cardiovascular and psychological strain during those decisions. We brought childless committed couples into our lab. They filled out a pre-lab survey. We then hooked them up to all kinds of stuff, EKG, skin conductance. They got sociometric badges. They're being videotaped. It's a very involved lab setup. We then take a baseline measure where they have just a discussion with the researcher to kind of get baseline measures of cardiovascular activity and activity with those sociometric badges. And then they negotiate 3 different scenarios. So a daily decision, an anchoring decision, and then a decision that they come up with. So we instruct them to come up with something that's important to their everyday lives, maybe something they frequently negotiate or something that they know they're going to have to negotiate in the near future, just to get a decision that's definitely kind of tailored to them. And then, of course, they're debriefed and compensated. So a couple examples of our scenarios that we give them. This top left one is an anchoring decision. So baby, definitely anchoring, sets the stage for work family decisions in the future, as compared to caring for an aging family member where you might have to provide a little bit of care in the coming months to help your aging aunt who broke her hip. So measures that I'm going to present here are heart rate and the root mean squared standard deviation between heartbeats, heart rate variability essentially. These were all scored and independently audited. And then we have state anxiety and threat after each scenario. So we found the opposite of our hypothesis. So you see the baseline here has higher, we have higher average heart rate during baseline sessions compared to anchoring, daily, or couple decisions. And those couple generated decisions, in fact, had the lowest heart rate on average compared to the other sessions. When we look at heart rate variability, we similarly see the opposite pattern. So when couples are negotiating that couple-generated decision, we see higher heart rate variability compared to a baseline session. When we look at state anxiety, we do see similarly that couple decision comes out again. So people are more anxious when they're negotiating the couple-generated decision compared to the other decisions. And then we did just compare to see, are these statistically significant levels, and each of them are. And similarly, we see threat is highest for that couple-generated decision. So thankfully, some consistencies, although not all in the direction we expected. There was no effect of sex on heart rate and heart rate variability, but there was a main effect of sex on anxiety. So women were more anxious across these different negotiation scenarios compared to their male partners. The effect was not significant for threat, but trending in the same direction. So some kind of takeaways here. We did not see the expected kind of fight or flight reaction while couples are negotiating decisions. I think what we saw was more indicative of self-regulation. And this is in combination with those threat and anxiety reactions, right? So they report feeling threatened or anxious, and that's at the same time they have lower heart rate variability, or higher heart rate variability, I'm sorry, which indicates that they're feeling emotions and maybe effortfully regulating those while they're negotiating decisions. The fact that we found the strongest results for that couple-generated scenario also has important methodological implications. So I think this was obviously the most realistic and relevant scenario. And it suggests that when we do vignettes in the lab, especially around work family issues, which many decision-making studies have, we probably want to use vignettes that maybe are generated by the couple, right, and that are relevant for the couple. And if we use kind of vignettes that we made, we might not be getting the same kinds of reactions. We also found that females experience more negative affect. Again, maybe this is contributing to why we see male-type decisions. And then there's a lot more to explore here. We've got a lot of data, so I'm excited to dig in. Yeah?
Could you classify the couple's decisions into the anchoring or episodic, or the scenarios of Brown, not the decisions, to see if there's a difference there to kind of get rid of the realistic problems that you may have with the baby and the aunt?
Oh, yeah. So are what the couples generate daily versus anchoring? We could. So I haven't dug into that qualitative data at all. We've got their responses, we've got what they came up with there for their scenario, and certainly we could do that to compare daily and anchoring that they came up with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
How long did they discuss these?
So they had 2 minutes to write down their own individual response, and then they had 8 minutes to discuss and arrive at an agreed upon solution. We did a lot of piloting around the timing, and that tended to be good. Most couples are done before the 8 minutes. Very rarely do we like run up against the time.
I guess I'm kind of baffled that you could negotiate taking care of a child for 6 or 8 minutes. But I'm thinking, you know, a lot of the work-family balance issue when it comes to these kinds of responsibilities is much better taken in a longitudinal way, because couples ultimately find ways to sort of balance things off. So if say both members of the couple are at work and the alarm goes off and says your water heater's exploded, you know, then it's a negotiation. I'll do this, but you know, next time the dog needs to go to the vet, you take the dog. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that it's a negotiated thing, but it also, there's an ebb and flow to it.
I totally agree with you. And actually there are a few studies on this. One is an experience sampling study, and it does suggest that people flip. So like when you prioritize work over family, the next time you'll prioritize family over work. And it wasn't a couple study, but that could potentially be because people are negotiating with their partner to change, right?
Well, I mean,
who takes care of what.
You even do that when the infant starts crying at 3 in the morning.
Right.
It's your turn.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it would be really interesting to look at this, to take this more to an experience sampling context and look at it over time as it unfolds. I agree. Yeah.
So I think piggybacking off of Chris's question, I noticed both of the vignettes that you had posed were kind of in that family domain. Was that intentional, or did you put work kind of centered vignettes out there?
Yeah, so there were two, so they were randomized. There were 2 potential daily ones and 2 potential anchoring ones. The other anchoring one was a new job. So new job opportunity, but you have to move. What are you guys going to do? And the other daily one was date night, but it was also work related. So it was like you had this special date night planned, but surprise work call, and you have this like thing you have to do. What are you going to do? So those were a little bit more work focused.
So would it be fair to say that the couples that participated were the more harmonious ones?
Potentially, yeah. There's certainly some generalizability issues here, right? In terms of saying that this is what actually happens in real life. I'm not sure. We probably have some selection bias in here, because couples who are really going to fight are probably not going to be so much in here.
Unless you pitched it as like counseling.
Right? Yeah. I don't know. I feel like the IRB would not be pleased with that. But yeah, that's definitely a potential issue, and maybe why we see 8-minute resolution times. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last study, but we can talk more about this if you guys want at the end. So this last study, very near and dear to my heart. It's my dissertation, and I love my dissertation still, even years later. So what I'm presenting for you today is material that we're splitting into 2 different studies. So the first actually is the second round under review, Journal of Applied Psychology. And then the second, my wonderful student Kate is helping me to publish right now. So the purpose of this was really to understand when work-family conflicts occur and what happens during and after that work-family conflict. So similarly, taking the last question we looked at, but studying it in the field, right, using an experience sampling methodology. So the first question that I wanted to tackle, because we're studying work-family conflicts in the wild, I wanted to see if we can predict when these things happen, right? And so to do that, I used border and boundary theory, which basically suggests that we have work stuff and we have family stuff, and those are separated by time and space boundaries, right? So for example, you might mostly work during the day between the hours of 9 and 5, and maybe you do most of your work at home. Similarly, we do family stuff in certain times at certain places. Now, on a daily basis, we often transition in between those roles. So, for example, I might leave here, walk home, transition into my family role. So this process is considered to be effortful, right? In that it involves time, it might involve physical activity, it might involve cognitively switching, emotionally switching, and so this is supposed to be an effortful process. And sometimes we don't make it all the way, right? So maybe you're at home saying hello to your loving spouse and you're trying to listen to them, but you just can't stop thinking about reviewer 2, that annoying comment that they left on my review. And so as a result, now you're not paying attention to your spouse, and what happens? You have a work-family conflict. Spouse is like, you're not paying attention to me, I know you're not focusing, and so conflict event. You're not meeting your family responsibilities because you're distracted by work. So I predicted, based on this theory, that we're going to see work-family conflicts when people transition. So when people report transitioning in terms of space between work and home spaces, and when people task switch or switch time between work and family. I also, for this study, honed in on standard hour workers, and standard hour workers tend to have an ebb and flow to their week that's pretty regular. So you go to work in the morning, you leave in the afternoon, you start the work week on Mondays, and you end the work week on Fridays. So I predicted these are kind of larger, kind of more daily, weekly rhythm transition times where we're going to, again, be likely to see conflict events. Now, in addition to predicting that onset, I wanted to look at, again, acute reactivity. Surely we will see that work-family conflict is stressful at some point. And so I again predicted when we have a work-family conflict, we're going to see an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, as well as negative affect and fatigue. And because, again, we're looking at these in the wild, I wanted to look at not only synchronous reactivity to those episodes, but also change over time after those episodes. So how does that affect you the rest of the day? There are a couple of patterns that we might expect. We might expect that you react and then just kind of recover throughout the rest of the day. We might expect that you react and then kind of stay elevated over time. Or we might expect that you have no response, right? I didn't formally hypothesize this because the interpretation is a little bit ambiguous, but I considered it when interpreting my results. In addition, we might see accumulation effects. So maybe if you just have one work-family conflict, it's not a big deal. I can handle that. My partner gets a little bit mad at me because I'm distracted, but it's no big deal. We move on like 10 minutes later. But what then happens if it happens again? 30 minutes later, and then maybe again later that night, and then maybe again, or again, right? And so at this point, you've got a lot of work-family conflict happening all within a fairly short amount of time. So does this accumulation of work-family conflict events change our, again, negative affect, fatigue, and heart rate and blood pressure throughout the day? So to do this, I used an experience sampling methodology. I recruited participants from my local community through variety of flyering methods. We met with everyone in person for a 1-hour baseline session where they filled out demographics. They then were trained on a little blood pressure, heart rate ambulatory monitor, and we trained them on the study procedures. The next Monday or Wednesday, randomly assigned, they began the experience sampling study. So for the first 3 days, they filled out a survey every 2 hours, starting at 8 a.m. and ending at 10 p.m. So this allowed us to get at those nice kind of change trajectories throughout the day. And because we didn't want to burn people out, we just had one survey per day at the end of the day for the last 4 days of the week. So this allowed us to capture when work-family conflicts are happening throughout an entire week, but also allowed us to get those more fine-grained change analyses for the first few days. So fortunately for me, we had pretty good compliance. So half of my participants completed absolutely everything perfectly. Most people completed most stuff. And then compliance across the days, again, generally pretty good. So no steep drop-offs there. We do have a multi-level model here. So as in the previous study, we used multi-level modeling, accounting for 3 levels of nested data, time points within days within individuals. So what we see here is essentially the results of a multi-level logistic regression. Found support for my hypothesis. Yeah. So when people transitioned between work and family tasks, they were between 7 and 8 times more likely to also report a work-family conflict event. Similarly, when they transitioned between work and family locations, they were between 2 and 4 times more likely to experience a work-family conflict event compared to non-transition times. We also saw partial support for those morning and afternoon transitions, and interestingly, this was in a specific direction, so it mattered which way you were transitioning. So in the morning, as you're transitioning into work, you're more likely to experience a family to work conflict. This makes sense. Families interfering with your ability to start working. And similarly, in the afternoon, we see the opposite trend. So as you're trying to transition into the family, we see increased likelihood of work to family conflict. And then there was no significant difference for Monday versus other days or Friday versus other days.
For the previous one, can it possibly be the opposite? Like if you're with your family, can the family be interfering with your work?
Possibly. It could happen because you might have like telecommuting, for example,
Okay.
right, where you're working in the home domain. Yeah, possibly.
Okay.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip these very specific things. We only found one significant pattern that was consistent with my hypotheses. That was this beautiful pattern where when work-family conflict happens, we see increased fatigue that then kind of recovers, and then you see goes along its merry way, just increasing at a linear rate that would be expected throughout the day. So most of the reactivity and recovery hypotheses did not come out as expected. Instead, we saw a lot with accumulation. So it's not one work-family conflict event, but when you experience multiple, that we start seeing changes in psychological strain and systolic blood pressure in particular. So in general, we did see that work-family conflict occurs during transitions. Not a whole lot of support for cardiovascular reactivity, and not a whole lot of support for this idea of one work-family conflict event as eliciting kind of the traditional stress reaction, right? Instead, what we see is that as work-family conflict events accumulate, we start to see changes in psychological and physiological strain. Yeah?
How many of these work-family conflict episodes did you find among these people?
That's a good question. So we had 114 work-to-family conflicts and 124 family-to-work conflicts.
And what's out of, trying to get a sense of out of what? How many opportunities did they have to express
Yeah,
such a-
like 2,300 something, like 36 was the number of within-person observations. So 106 people reported like 2,000 some odd observations. Of those, 114 were work-to-family conflict experiences, and 124 were family-to-work conflict experiences.
So, I mean, that's a good thing, that people aren't kind of overwhelmed by these conflicts on a daily
Yes.
basis.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that we're finding in the episodic literature, right? This is, I think, probably the 5th or 6th study to try and look at this in an experience sampling context. And what we see is that they're really not that common, right? You maybe experience a couple a week, if that. But certainly less common than you would have thought just offhandedly beforehand, given the way we talk about them in the literature, based on those more levels-based measures. Yeah.
Do you have ways of looking at, so if the accumulation looks like a frequency metric, and then you can also think about it in terms of duration or intensity.
Yeah.
So do you have a way of looking at it that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wanted to look at duration, but the measurement would have just been horrendous. So I did not tackle duration. I did, however, tackle intensity. So for every work-family conflict event, people then reported more information about their conflict. So I specifically had them report how distressing is this event, how much did it interfere with your plans, how much did it interfere with your goals, and then I also have some data on like social others involved. So this is essentially the scale points, right, from very slightly or not at all to extremely, and what you can see here across the events is that they're generally not super distressing, right? So even when we look directly at those appraisals, people are not really appraising these as stressful. Yeah.
Did you get a measure of like how common the stressor was? So like the first time my kid got sick, I might be really stressed out about it, but the 10th time it's like, I know how to handle this, it's fine.
Yeah, that's, yeah. That's it. So kind of we got at that. So this was a checklist of work-family conflict events based on other qualitative work-family conflict events work. We did also, though, measure chronic work-family conflict, and I did run some analyses looking at, controlling for work-family conflict, chronic conflict, or using that as a moderator. So do we see stronger reactions when people are experiencing more chronic conflict, or is it an adaptive thing where they actually experience weaker reactions? It didn't actually, nothing really came out there. Yeah.
This is pretty related to the previous question, but in looking at when work-family conflicts occur, did you guys come across any like sort of interactive like compounding effects of like in one day, say like in the morning when you transition from family to work, you experience a work-family conflict, and then maybe at work, or then at work, you get that call, your kid is sick, you need to pick them up, whatever, and then does the occurrence of maybe more conflicts throughout the day sort of like make the later ones more have a negative effect?
Yeah, so the accumulation analyses were trying to get at that, right, in looking at as the number increases throughout the day, do we see changes? I did not look to see if so I dug into this a little bit in that if people reported multiple conflicts within the last 2 hours, I looked at that again as like a predictor or an interaction with, how stressful this is, and again, I didn't really find much there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I'm thinking about personal experiences and how daily work-family conflicts occur, but they're regular.
Yeah.
And then everything seems, it's like, okay, homeostasis, but then something will happen. And then it's like, oh, like that conflict is like too much. Okay. But it's the same conflict. It just,
It's
like
a tipping point?
changes. Yes, exactly. Or it's just something goes awry. Everything's like a well-oiled machine. And something changes, and now I don't know how to express what I mean.
Yeah. So actually, I don't know how to test that, and I think we would need a little bit more digging in at perhaps the couple level, actually, because I think a lot of these conflicts, there is like a set routine, right? Like a troubleshooting framework that couples negotiate and that you follow. So this conflict occurs, well, I already know what to do because we've had this conflict, and so I'm going to follow my set troubleshooting routine. And so perhaps it's when that routine gets disrupted that then we see kind of more extreme conflict events. I agree. I don't know how to quite capture that, but I think it would be really interesting.
It's possible, if I'm understanding Audrey's question correctly, that you used a time sample. It's possible that with an event sampling procedure, you might be able to
Get it
people
more
actually
extreme.
report to you when they're about to when they're experiencing this thing. You train them to notice that and report it and get the features instead of the time sample. Yeah, so we talked a lot about the design, and this is actually, we submitted something to SIOP on like best practices in doing this kind of work. And I think, so that's to say one of the other presentations is talking about this specific issue. The reason that we ended up going with the time design is because with work-family conflict, you're probably not going to report it in the middle of your conflict, right? So either way, it would be retrospective. And one of the objectives here too, I kind of thought that conflicts were happening a little bit more often than what we were seeing in previous literature, and I did find a little bit higher frequencies here. And so I
I wanted to make sure that everyone was reporting everything that was happening. Although I think with an event-based sample, you're right, you would get at more extreme conflicts that people like really recognize, like, oh, this was terrible, and I spent like, an hour trying to figure out what to do here, and it was very stressful. I think you would get more of those events with an event-based sampling.
But
Yeah.
Couldn't you just ask them? Like, I mean, with the time-based sample, if something non-routine, could you ask them, like, or is this a non-routine kind of work-family conflict, or is it
Yeah.
not? And it would essentially get at the same thing, so you could see it differently. You wouldn't have to rely on the participants again to report these things.
That's true, but I think if it was, I think to Howard's point, you're trying to get at more kind of emotional episodes or those kind of higher, like the tipping point episodes. And so if that's what you're trying to capture, I think that that would be appropriate. You would probably also capture it using this design, but then you would also capture all of these other conflicts that are like not big deals. So I think it would depend on your purpose, right? If you were trying to get every conflict or just kind of the big stuff.
I have some concerns about the whole, work-family conflict issue, because it seems to me that it really very much depends on the kind of job that you have and the kind of losses that you're going to encounter based on the situation. If you're an hourly employee or you work on billable hours, for example, then, and if you have to take 2 hours off of work to go do carpool or do something like that, then it has a real specific cost associated with it. If you're a salary worker, or if you've got personal leave time, it's an inconvenience sometimes, or it just means you have to work more, on a weekend or whatever. It gets, or work harder. But it's very different for people who literally have to take time off of work to handle a conflict. Or if it's an emotional conflict, that means they've got a timeshare or multitask that conflict. I'm not sure that we should handle all those things and lump them into the same category.
I agree with you. I agree with you so much. This is actually where a lot of the work that I did in my master's was trying to focus on low-income workers and trying to see, my thesis was a commensurability test to see, do these measures actually work the same in low-income shift worker populations as when we use them in these more traditional populations. We found the answer was yes, but I think that's because the levels-based measures are so general. Same thing here. I think these measures are so general that they can be used to capture those. What we're missing are those intricacies that you're discussing on what factors into that decision, right? What does that actually look like? And I think that would be an interesting next step. One of the things I'd really like to do is look at how, for example, money influences our work-family decision-making, and that's going to be very different for a shift worker compared to a salaried worker. So I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I think that's a step that we need to take this. Yeah?
These studies are essentially descriptive. And I wonder what applications they have. And what interventions, or even the notion of intervention, does it make any sense? I mean, so what do we do about this?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. These are mostly kind of theoretically focused, what is actually happening. I think that they help to set the foundation for for practical implications. So, if we are seeing that one work-family conflict event is like not such a big deal, whereas multiple accumulated events are a big deal, then that would suggest things like recovery are really important, right, for managing work and family. So stopping that accumulation process. Similarly, understanding when work-family conflicts occur is important for designing interventions, right? So it's a very basic question, but then it helps us to understand, well, is flex time really effective if people are still making transitions, right? Or maybe flex place is more effective because then you're not really location switching between work and family. So I think that there are practical implications, but perhaps this is one step away from more directly making that connection, but it does help to set the foundation.
But Jack, it's pretty obvious no, Jack, it's obvious. If you want to solve this, you either don't have a family or you don't have a job.
That's an option. I don't know whether I recommend that option.
One that has certain pragmatic. But this becomes even more important, it seems to me, as Bill raised the issue, I was thinking about the same thing.
Yeah.
With a vast number of workers who have more than one job in order to be able to survive.
Yeah.
They may be a single family, single mother, et cetera. I mean,
Yeah.
stresses that most of us couldn't even begin to comprehend,
Yeah.
never mind handle. And we kind of know how awful that is. The question is, what can anyone do about that?
That is the $1 million question. I will get back to you in 20 years.
Well, it has to do with socio-political decisions.
It does.
And as far away from this level of analysis as possible.
Well, it's a really interesting point, I think, because this research seems to be about normal people and normal jobs, and that's not unimportant. But now with precarious work and
Yeah.
the way the work is, I mean, for some people, their work is so stressful that they don't have the luxury
Right.
even worry about work-family conflict. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And those people are just not accessible to us in the kind of research.
Well, more difficult to, I would say they're more difficult to access, not inaccessible, but yeah.
So, if I'm assuming correctly, some of this work-family conflict is due to rumination about work after you go home and vice
Some of
versa?
it, yeah, so there are, I could pull up the frequencies. Most of these conflicts are more time-based conflicts, but some of them are psychological conflicts.
So would it be possible to measure at an individual difference level the tendency to ruminate and then see if at level 1 that moderates things that are
Yeah.
happening at the episodic level?
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting, and certainly pulling an individual. One of the comments that we got when trying to publish it, that was looking at this issue of like, not everybody is the same. So what kind of individual difference factors might predict variance in how people are reacting to conflict events? So I do think that's an important future step to take this, right now that we've kind of established a baseline.
I ruminate a lot. So.
Yeah, you and me both. Yeah.
Back on the points about the socioeconomic status or hourly versus salary and those very real concerns, I think there's also a flip side though, which is that those in corporate settings and other workplaces, there's some policy implications for workplaces because I've observed and experienced myself the increased stress people feel when they may have the flexibility, but there's that issue of needing to keep up the appearances, the potential of being penalized for not being fully there and fully committed.
Right.
And people having to kind of sneak around, I mean, not, saying, yes, we have to leave for the afternoon, but not saying necessarily why. They really minimize the family aspect. So I think while they're considering the challenges of those who are, hourly workers or working multiple jobs to make ends meet, really important, but I think another interesting angle of this could be the extent at which people feel they need to keep up appearances.
Yeah. So
What
there.
that means for workplace policies, because
Right.
companies, and I think we have a slanted view here in academia because there's pretty good flexibility.
Right.
But in many work settings, there's just sort of lip service given to work family, as you well know.
Yeah.
Family balance.
Yeah. So kind of two comments on that. One is that an emerging construct is telepressure. And so the extent that you feel pressure to constantly be on the job over your phone, over the computer, even when you're at home. So that is something that researchers are starting to look at. But then two, actually your point kind of highlights something that so we're writing a grant to study work family issues in single mothers, particularly around how can we possibly build resilience through everyday recovery behaviors. And one of the things that you look to in the literature is you can't find anyone saying that things are more stressful for, like, in terms of work family. So you can't find anything that says, single mothers have more work family conflict than not single mothers. And I think that's because of the issues that we raise, right? So it depends largely on the occupational context. It depends on different aspects of your family context. And so it's difficult to kind of make blanket statements like certain populations are more stressed than other populations, because really there's a lot that goes into that. Yeah.
You're not making any distinctions between challenge and hindrance stressors here?
Not here, no. I would consider work-family conflict by definition is a hindrance because you're thwarting performance in one domain, so you're hindering yourself. So I would argue by definition it's a hindrance, but I have not run the validation work to show that.
Well, I'm thinking about, taking on an extra task at work, volunteering for travel, versus, going to your kid's high school play or seeing your infant's first steps. Those all seem like challenge stressors to me as opposed to hindrance stressors.
Time pressure.
Time pressure. Well, but see, then you're focusing on the time pressure. You're focusing on the taking on extra responsibility. So it's not the work-family conflict that you're talking about. It's the challenge that you're talking about.
Well, the challenge is in one place that causes a hindrance in the other place.
Oh, interesting.
Well, there's a literature on work-to-family spillover and positive spillover and negative spillover. So if it's a good challenge stressor, you might have positive spillover.
Potentially.
No, I think that the point is if you're spending more time on the one, you're taking time away from the other.
But if your boss announces that you have a promotion, that's a challenge stressor, but you might actually have a better in your family.
All right, so I think we're actually out of time. But thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.